Hello. I am the Linux Mitch. Today, I'm going to show you how to do a dual boot with Arch Linux and Windows 10. And then I'm going to show you how to change the kernel in Linux. And there's a reason why I'm going to show you that. And then I'm going to show you how to delete your whole Arch Linux system and to put your Windows 10 back to normal. So, let's get to it. Right now, I'm in a virtual machine of Windows 10. And I'm going to open up my file manager. And what I'm going to do is click on my C drive. And I'm going to right click it. And I'm just going to look up properties. I gave this is a virtual machine of Windows 10. And I gave this drive 127 gigabytes. And of course, if you're doing this in a bare metal computer, you probably have at least 500 gigabytes, perhaps a terabyte or 2 terabytes. But because this is a virtual machine, I just gave it 127 gigabytes. And you can see in the blue is how much space is used. And the gray is how much is empty. So most of it's empty. And it tells you right here, used space is 23.8 gigs, right? And the free space is 103 gigabytes. Now what I'm going to do is, and I did a video the other day on my Windows 10 virtual machine, and I installed Firefox and I installed iTunes, and that video was explaining how to use iTunes and how the best way to use iTunes is either in a bare metal Windows machine or a Windows virtual machine. It's the best way to use iTunes, but this video is not about iTunes. I'm going to go to the Start menu and I'm going to right click it. And it brings up this menu. I'm going to go to Disk Management. Now, if Disk Management doesn't show up in your menu, then you have to go into a search and type in Disk Management. But I'm going to right click here. It works for me. Disk Management is right here. So I'm going to open it up. And I'm going to make it full screen. So you can see my CD-ROM. I have nothing in it. And this is 100 megabyte healthy EFI system partition. This is 127 gigabyte partition with my Windows in it. And this is a 522 megabyte healthy recovery partition. Now these partitions, I didn't make it. When I installed this Windows virtual machine, it automatically made all these partitions on the drive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this on. I'm going to right click it and I'm going to shrink it down because I'm going to use part of this drive for my Arch Linux installation. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to shrink volume. So you can read this little paragraph here. It's just telling you you can't shrink the volume less than what's available. So I mean, it depends on how big your drive is and how much stuff you have in it. So of course, if you have a lot of videos and music and other kinds of stuff in it, you may not be able to shrink it too much depending on what the size of your drive. I'm going to shrink this 22 gigabytes. And the reason why is because I'm going to install Arch Linux and I'm not going to really do anything with it. So if this was a real situation and I was dual booting with half a terabyte hard drive, I might want to split it in half and use half for Windows and half for Arch Linux. Or if I had a terabyte, I might want to do half and half or whatever. But because it's just for demonstration for the video, and because it's a small drive to begin with, it's only, I mean, the whole drive before Windows was installed, the whole drive, it tells you right here, it's 130 gigabytes. So it's a 130 gigabyte drive. And with Windows installed and iTunes installed and Firefox installed, I only have 105 gigabytes left. Okay. So I'm going to shrink it. I'm going to make a 22 gigabyte drive for Arch Linux. And like I said, I'm not going to really be using the Arch Linux. It's just to play with and to see how it works and for the video. Okay, so I'm going to type in here. Let's do 22,000. 22,000. And I'm going to shrink it. So this is my healthy EFI system partition for booting into Windows. It's 100 megabytes. And now I have left on my C drive my Windows, 105 gigabytes left, and I have 21.5 gigabyte unallocated. And I'm going to use that for my Arch Linux installation. And this is just a healthy recovery partition that was automatically there from when I installed the Windows. So now I'm going to close this and I'm going to power down. So I'm going to hit the power button. I'm going to shut down. And maybe I'll pause the video. Windows doesn't shut down as fast as Arch Linux does, right? So I don't know how long this is going to be spinning. So I guess I'll just pause the video until it's paused. So don't go away. I'll be back. Oh, I guess I didn't have to pause it. So now, because this is a virtual machine and I'm using Virt Manager, I have to attach the Arch Linux live ISO to it. Now, if you're doing this on hard drive, in bare metal, I should say, if you're doing this on a real computer, you want to shut down the computer. You want to plug in a thumb drive of Arch Linux with a bootable ISO on it. And then you want to boot. Oh, and of course, if you're doing this on bare metal, of course, you're going to have to do it the way you always do it. First of all, you're going to have to go into the BIOS and make sure your Windows secure boot is turned off. And then you're going to have to go into the BIOS when you're booting up by hitting, F12. Could be F2, it could be delete, whatever. You have to go into your BIOS, and not only do you have to make it sure that your secure boot is off, but you have to let the system boot onto your thumb drive. But I'm doing this in a virtual machine, so I'm going to attach the live ISO to the virtual machine and boot into it that way. And of course, I'm using Virt Manager. So I'm going to open up and I'm going to go here. I'm attaching the January 1st, 2024 Arch Linux ISO. And like I said, if you're doing it in a computer, you have to plug in your thumb drive and boot onto it. And now I'm just going to go into boot options and I'm going to make sure the CD-ROM is booted into first. And now we are going to boot into the live ISO within my Windows 10. The live Arch Linux ISO, that is. And let's make it full screen. And there we are. So we booted onto the live ISO. And first thing I'm going to do is set font here -132B. I'm going to clear the screen, and this first thing I'm going to do is optional. And if you've been following my channel and watching my videos, you would know this. I'm going to vim into etc Pacman Conf, and I'm just going to scan down, and I'm going to activate verbose line and parallel downloads. And then I'm going to save the file. And now I'm going to vim into etc. Let's clear the screen. And again, that first thing is optional. And this one's also optional too, because we're going to use the installer, but we're going to do a few things different. And of course, in the installer, you can just go and click on to select mirrors from your country, which is the fastest and the easiest way to do it. But I like to do this. I like to have more control over the mirrors that I install. And I've already showed in previous videos how to select good mirrors and how to look on the Arch website to find out which mirrors are the best to use at this particular moment. So I'm not going to show that again. I'm going to vim into etc Pacman D mirror list. And what I'm going to do is, you know what? I'm going to make this LTY one the first one. I'm going to leave these other mirrors in here just in case something happens. But I'm going to select, and of course, in this video, just to save time, I'm not going to go and download all the mirrors from the whole world. A lot of times in my install videos, I will download over 900 mirrors from all over the world, and then I'll select my mirrors, but just to save time, I'm not going to do that now. And this first mirror period LTY, I know it's in good shape because I checked it out off camera. So I'm going to save the file, and I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to sync my mirrors. Okay, now I'm going to go through some steps before we go into the installer. Okay, so I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to do lsblk. Now we can see we have 4 partitions on the drive. And of course my mouse doesn't work because I'm in a terminal. I'm in a TTY, I'm not in a terminal. So you can see SDA1 is a 100 meg partition. And we saw that when we were in Windows, that is the Windows EFI boot partition. It's 100 megs. I didn't make that. Windows put it in when I installed Windows. It was put in automatically by the Windows system. Okay, now SDA2 is just a 16 meg partition, a free partition that the Windows system made. SDA3 is 105.9 gigabyte partition for my Windows installation, and it's shrunk now, it's smaller. And the 522 SDA4 522 is a partition that Windows made as well. Now, we made a new partition, but we can't see it. It's not showing, right? Because we shrunk the drive down, and we could see there was a 22 gigabyte partition, but we can't see it. Where is it? So what we're going to do is this. Before we go into the installer, we're going to do some steps. Because this is not going to be a manual install. We're going to use the automated installer, but we've got to do some manual steps before and after the installation before we reboot. So I'm going to type in cfdisk/dev/SDA. Okay. Now you got to make sure maybe yours is not SDA, but this is. So the drive is called SDA. I'm going to cfdisk into it. We can see the first one, SDA1, is the 100 megabyte EFI partition for booting into Windows. 16 megabyte is just free space. The 105.9 gigabyte is the Microsoft system. It's SDA3. Free space, here is the 21.5 gigabyte free space that we made that we're going to use for our Arch Linux installation. 522 Windows is just a recovery partition that Windows made, and 2 megabytes is just a free space that Windows made. So you got to make sure you're, on the right drive. You don't want to mess up your Windows system, especially if this is a bare metal computer that you're dependent on. And that's another thing too, is that I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the video. If you follow these instructions, there's always a possibility you could mess up your system. And now my helper is here. But like I was saying, if you're doing this on a real computer and not a virtual machine, there's always the possibility you could mess up your system. Be aware of that. And if your system gets messed up, don't blame me. And really you should have, and especially if you're doing this on a real computer, you should have all your important files, videos, music, spreadsheets, Word documents, letters, emails, whatever you have on your hard drive that you need, passwords, whatever it is that's on your hard drive that you need, you should have it backed up. And I should have told you that before we partitioned the Windows drive, because the system could get damaged even when you're in Windows and you're shrinking the drive and creating free space for Arch Linux. At that point, you could lose stuff. Probably not, but you could. So we're going to take this free space and I'm going to click on New. And you know what? I'm going to hide my face. And we're going to click on New. So just make sure you're on the right spot. And I'm going to make a 1 gig. Now you don't have to make 1 gig, but I'm going to. I'm going to make a 1 gig partition. Okay. Now look at how it jumped up to SDA4. So what we got to do is we got to make sure you're on the right partition when you're doing these things. I can use my arrow key to go back down to the brand new 1 gig partition that I made. And it's called a Linux file system, but I don't want it to be that because there's going to be a boot partition for booting into Linux, my Arch Linux. So I'm going to go use my arrow keys and I'm going to go to type. Now I'm going to go up the list, right up to the top to where it says EFI session, where it says EFI system, and I'm going to hit enter. So now it says EFI system. So we have a 1 gig EFI system that's going to be used for booting into Arch Linux. So now you see I have 20.5 gigabyte left of free space. I'm going to click on new, and it says 20.5 gigabyte, and I click it on, and it says Linux files. Okay, we have 100 megs for EFI system, 16 meg for Microsoft, 105 gig for my Windows installation, 522 megabytes window recovery, 1 gig EFI for my boot into Arch Linux, and 20.5 gigabytes for my Arch Linux installation. So everything looks good. So I'm going to use my arrow keys to go down to right. I'm going to click on right, and I'm going to type in yes. I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to quit. There it is. And it's syncing the disks. So now I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to bring back my face. So now I'm going to do lsblk. So now you can see we have SDA5 is 1 gig, and that's going to be for my Arch Linux boot partition. And SDA6 is 20.5 gigs, and that's going to be for my Arch Linux system. Okay, so now I'm going to make my SDA5, which is 1 gig, I'm going to make that a boot partition file system. So I'm going to do mkfs-b fat capital F, and make sure it's a capital F. Leave a space and type in 32. Leave a space, dev /SDA5. Now you have to be very careful you do the right driver. You could mess up your Windows system. Okay, so let's hit enter, and that worked. Now I'm going to make a file system for SDA6, which is my 20.5 gigabyte partition, and that's where my Arch Linux is going to be installed. I'm going to do mkfs, ext4 space dev SDA6. Let's hit enter. And it's making a file system, and MKFS stands for make file system, by the way. Okay, let's clear the screen. So we've made file system, so let's do an lsblk again. And I'm going to mount them now. So before I mount them, I'm going to do mkdir make dir. I'm making a directory mnt/archinstall. Hit enter. Now I'm going to mount my SDA6, my main drive, to it. So I'm going to do mount dev SDA6 /mnt/archinstall. And it's mounted. Now I'm going to make another directory, make dir mnt/archinstall /boot. And now I'm going to mount SDA5.1 gig boot partition to there. So I'm going to mount dev SDA5 /mnt/archinstall /boot. So what we want to do is, after you've mounted them, you should lsblk again. So we can see SDA5, it's mounted to archinstall boot, And SDA6, it's mounted to archinstall. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make this just a little smaller. Set font here dash 128 normal. Okay, I just made it a little smaller, and let's type in archinstall. So we're going to skip mirrors because I already selected the mirrors. The locales I'm going to change to English Canada. I'm going to go back. Disk configuration. Now normally when I use the automated installer, I use best effort, default partition layout. Don't use that. And don't use manual partitioning. We're going to use pre-mounted. So I'm going to click enter. And at this point, I'm going to type in /mnt/archinstall. And I'm just going to go back up to check it out. And so we go back up and we can see disk configuration. If you look at the bottom, we can see SDA5, the 1 gig, is mounted, and SDA6, our primary drive, the 21 gigabytes, is mounted. Okay, so it looks good. So I'm going to bypass disk inscription. Now bootloader, normally, because my system is an old system, normally I use grub. But if you see here, system deboot was automatically in there by default because it's reading the Windows drive or the Windows partition, and it knows that it's going to need system deboot to log into the Windows partition. So I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Now you could change it to grub, EFI stub, and liming, but I'm just going to leave it on the system D default the way it was. Unified kernel images, I'm going to leave it false. Swap, I'm going to change to no, like I always do. Host name, I'm going to call this Arch Dual. You can call it whatever you want, and that's easy to change after the fact. Root password, I'm going to put my root password in. I'm going to verify it. Profile, now you could go into profile. You could go into type. You could go down here to desktop, and you could choose a desktop. But I don't use this, and if you've been following my channel, you know that. Let's go back. And if you've been following my channel, and I use, regardless of whether I'm doing a manual install or using the Arch automated installer, I always do a base install with root only. Then after the fact, I make a user with sudo and password, and I put all my programs in and everything I want to do. So I'm going to skip profile, and I skip audio because I do that after the fact. Kernel, I'm going to change the kernel to LTS. Now, they give you 4 kernel options here. See? There's a kernel that I started using recently. It's the real-time long-term support kernel. So it's Linux-LT, sorry, it's Linux-RTLT, the real-time long-term support kernel. It's lighter and it uses less RAM, but they don't give you the option here. So that's why in this video, after everything is done, I'm going to show you how to change kernels, because changing kernels with system deboot is different than changing kernels with grub. So with grub, when you change a kernel or you add a kernel, or you delete a kernel, you always type in grub make config line. Well, with system deboot, it's different. So that's why I'm going to show you. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to show you how to delete the Linux and put your Windows partition back to normal. Okay? So I guess it's going to be a long video. So I'm going to pick that kernel, the LTS. Additional packages, I'm going to type in vim git and terminus-font. Verifying that the packages are there, and let's go. And you can see at the bottom, we're installing vim git and terminus font. And you know what? I'm going to install htop. And there's a reason why, because I'm not going to, this is just going to be a base install. I'm not going to install a user and all my packages and my GitLab repository and all the files and packages that I normally install, because I just want to show you how you can do a dual boot with Windows and Arch Linux And then I want to show you how to change the kernel, and then I want to show you how to delete it and put your Windows system back to normal. Okay? So I'm going to install htop, and let's go. So let's go back and see. Now the additional packages you can see at the bottom, it's Vim, Git, Terminus, Font, and htop. Good. Now there's a dog barking in the next apartment. I live in a building. This is a apartment building I live in, and there's a dog barking next door. I don't know if you can hear it or if the mic is picking it up. Now I'm going to go to network configuration, and I'm going to use network manager like I always do. Time zone is UTC. I'm going to change this to Canada Eastern like I always do, and true time, and we're done. Let's hit install. Let's hit enter, and I'm going to pause the video and come back when the installation is done. So don't go away. So the base system is installed. Would you like to chroot into the newly created installation and perform changes? Yes is the default. No is usually I go to no. I power down. I pull out my ISO. I log into the system and make a user and password, install all my programs I like to use. But the default is yes. And yes, we do want to make changes before we shut down or reboot. So I'm going to click on yes. And, I'm going to change the font. Set font tier -132B. There we go. It's a bit better. Okay. What I'm going to do is make directory /mnt/win10. Hit enter. SBLK, right? So we're mounting this SDA1, this 100 megabyte boot partition for Windows. So now I'm going to mount dev SDA1 /mnt/win10. And it's mounted. Now I'm going to CD into it. CD/mount win10. Now I'm going to ls it, and you should see this capital EFI in there. Now I'm going to CD into it. CD EFI. I'm going to ls it, and you should see boot and Microsoft in there. Now I'm going to type in this command: copy -r /mnt/win10/Microsoft /boot/EFI/. So notice in this line, EFI is capitalized, Microsoft, the M is capitalized, and at the end, the EFI is capitalized again. And if we did this right, we shouldn't get any errors. Good. Now we're going to check it to make sure that it worked. So I'm going to CD back to root. I'm going to CD into boot /EFI. And I'm going to ls it. And now we have 4 things in there. We have boot, Linux, Microsoft, and systemd. That means it worked. Now I'm going to exit and shut down. Shut down now. And I'm going to disconnect my Arch Linux Live ISO from the system. And if you're doing this on bare metal, you would shut down and pull out your thumb drive. So I'm going to go to here. This is the virtual machine. So I got to go here to disconnect it. I'm going to take off the live ISO. And I'm going to go to boot options. And I'm going to turn that off. Okay. And now we're going to boot into the system. Now, when we boot into the system, you're going to have 3 seconds. Okay. So what's going to happen is when you boot into the system, it's automatically going to go into your Linux system. If you want to go into Windows, you have 3 seconds to use your arrow buttons to move down to Windows. So let's go into Arch Linux first. I'm going to make it full screen. And hopefully this works. There we go. Looks like it's working. So you're going to see this little menu, and sorry I can't make it bigger, but automatically it's going to go into Arch Linux. And sorry about that menu. It only stays up for 3 seconds unless I pause it. You can use your arrow keys to pause it and then choose which one you want to boot into. And now we're at the login screen. So I don't have a display manager or LightDM installed. I don't have any programs installed except HTOP. So what I'm going to do is, and I don't have a user yet. So I'm going to type in, I'm going to go in as root. I'm going to put root's password in. I'm going to change the font here dash 132B. And I did that wrong. It should be set font. Okay, now I'm going to clear the screen and let's do an HTOP. So we're running at 142 megabytes of RAM. It's kind of high for the TTY in Arch Linux. And that's because we're on the, let's clear the screen. Let's do that again. We're on the LTS kernel. I'm going to put the real-time kernel in. And you know what? Let's do it now. So I'm going to do install. I was going to do this after the fact, but let's do this first. Install. Oops. Pacman. I don't need sudo because I'm in root. Install capital S Linux RT LTS. And let's download it. And it's just installing the real-time kernel. And this time we're not going to make grub because we're using system deboot rather than grub. And we're done. Now let's clear, let's clear screen and let's type in, now let's cd into boot, cd into bootloader entries. And let's ls it. So now we see we have the Linux LTS configuration file and the LTS fallback file, but we don't have the real-time kernel. It's installed, but it's not showing up there. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy 2024. We're going to copy the LTS kernel period conf to Linux. Now it's not all staying on one line because I have large print. Linux dash RT dash LTS period conf. Now we're going to ls it. So now we have 4 in there. We have the LTS and the fallback configuration files that were installed with the system. And we have the real time. And I did that fallback one wrong. It should be conf at the end. Let's move Linux fallback to Linux RT dash LTS dash fallback conf. Now let's clear the screen. Let's do ls again. Okay, that's better. So now we're going to change those files. We have to vim into the file. So we're going to do vim Linux conf. And we're going to change the name. And you know what? Oops. I'm going to change this to Linux RT LTS. Okay, and then we're going to change this to real-time LTS. And then we're going to change this line also. We're going to add in RT-LTS. And we're going to save the file. And now we're going to go ls again, and we're going to go into the fallback one. We're going to do vim Linux RT LTS fallback conf. And we're going to change this too. We're going to call this Linux RT dash LTS And we're going to add this dash RT. We're going to go here and we're going to add a dash RT. Okay, and we're going to save that file. And we're going to reboot. And a menu is going to come up. I'm going to pause the menu. So I'm going to hit my arrow buttons to pause the menu this time. Okay, so I've paused the menu. So now I have the choice of going into the first kernel, which is the LTS kernel that was installed with the automated installer when we installed the system, or into its fallback, or I can log into the real-time long-term support kernel or its fallback, or I can log into Windows 10. So let's log into, now automatically, it's all, whichever one ends up at the top is going to be the one that it automatically logs into. And I apologize for the small font. At this point, I can't change the font to this. I don't know how to change the font to this menu. Maybe there is a way, but I don't know how to do it. But it's, if you just let it go, and you only have 3 seconds. And if you let it go, it's automatically going to go into this one at the top. So you have to hit your arrows to pause it, and you have 3 seconds to do it. So let's log into the real-time long-term support kernel. And it's just booting into the system. And there we are. Now I'm going to type in root because I don't have a user. I'm going to put root's password in. I'm going to type in set font here dash 132B. And there we are. And let's do an htop. Let's do a uname r. And now we can see we're in the real-time kernel. And let's do an htop. If I installed all my systems and an awesome window manager or some desktop environment, of course the RAM is going to be a lot higher. But we're running at 94 megabytes of RAM. So that's how you change the kernel when you're using this method. Now let's log out of there. Let's reboot into Windows. Now we're going to have to hit our arrow button because it's automatically going to go into Linux. And it's going to go into the regular long-time support kernel because that happens to be at the top of the list. There we go. So now we paused it. So we're not going to go into long-term support kernel. I'm not going to go into the real-time long-term support kernel. I'm going to go into Windows 10. Let's click on. Let's see if we can boot into Windows 10. It's just booting in. And of course, you know what? I'm going to pause the video because it takes longer to boot into Windows. Wow, that took a long time to boot up. And there we are. And now we are in Windows. So I'm going to put my password in. I'm going to hit enter and I'm going to log into, we're logging into Windows. And here we are. We are in Windows 10. And you can see it's -11 here. Now what I'm going to do is open up my file manager and I'm going to go to local disk C. I'm going to right click it. I'm going to go to properties and we can see we're using 23.9 gigabytes for our Windows installation. I have 81 gigabytes left and here, this is it here. All the gray is free space. And I'm going to close that and I'm going to right click this on and then go to disk management. And here you have it. We have the 100 megabyte EFI for Windows, my Windows partition, 1 gigabyte for my EFI boot partition for Linux, Arch Linux that is, and 20.5 gigabytes for my Arch Linux install. Now, let's say you're dual booting and you say, you know what? I don't want to dual boot with Arch Linux in my Windows install. I want to put my Windows back to normal. So you could delete this now. Right here, we can delete this. So what's going to happen is if we delete this partition here, this is going to be dead space. You won't be able to use it. It's just going to be unusable dead space. Because we can't delete this boot partition here. It won't let us. Now, there might be a way to do it, and if there is, let me know in the comments, because I don't know everything. So because this is blocking it, this is going to be dead space, and we won't be able to increase our Windows partition and make our Windows partition larger back to the way it was. So what we could do is delete this now, and then we could log on to the Arch Linux Live ISO to delete this one in cfdisk. But since we're going in there anyways, we may as well just delete both. Okay? So what I'm going to do is close that. I'm going to power down. Oh, and it's just another thing too, and I don't know why, but when we're just doing this dual booting, the clock in Linux is always going to be right on. So when we relog into Linux, the clock will be good, but this clock is going to be off. So what I'm going to do is, what you could do is just go into adjust time and date. And I don't know why this dual booting is messing up the clock, but it is. Hit sync now, and it's going to sync it. Okay, now it fixed the time. Okay, now let's get out of there. So let's power down. It's shutting down, so I'm going to pause the video. Actually, that didn't take too long. So because of the virtual machine, I'm going to go and attach my ISO of Arch Linux. If this was a bare metal computer, you plug in your thumb drive with a bootable ISO image of Arch Linux, right? So I'm going to attach this. I'm going to apply it. And I'm going to set my boot options. And of course, if it was bare metal, to set your boot options, you would have to. And now we're going to boot back onto the live ISO. And of course, if this was bare metal, you'd have to make sure, when you're booting, you plug in your thumb drive. When you're booting in, you have to hit F12 or whatever number it is. That would get you onto the live ISO, F12, F2, F11, delete. I find it's usually, lately for me, it's always been F12. So now we're booting back onto the live ISO. We're going to go into cfdisk and delete the Linux partitions. And we're going to put our Windows back to normal. And then I'm going to close the video. Of course, I'm going to log back into Windows to show you that it's working. So let's make this set font here dash, let's make it 128, and I don't want to make it too big. So let's do lsblk. And what we're going to do is we're going to delete SDA5 and SDA6. Now, SDA6 we could have deleted in disk management within Windows, but it won't let us delete the SDA5 to 1 gig. Now, there might be a way to do it. I just don't know how to do it. So anyways, we're going to do this. cfdisk dev SDA. And now you have to be very careful. We're going to use our arrows to go up and down. We're going to highlight the 1 gig EFI system. And I use my arrow and I'm going to delete it. So now it says free space 1 gig. So it doesn't go away. It's still showing up there, but it's showing up as free space. Then I'm going to delete the 20 gig of my Linux file system. And of course, this is going to blow away the Linux install we just did. It's going to blow it away. Okay, so we got to make sure we're on the right thing. I'm going to use my arrow keys. I'm going to go delete. So now it's deleted, but it's still showing up. So we have free space 21.5 gig, right? So now what I'm going to do is I am going to use my arrow keys to write. I'm going to type in yes. And then I'm going to quit. And now I'm going to shut down. Shut down now. And then I'm going to disconnect my live ISO. And if this was bare metal, you would shut down your computer and pull out your thumb drive. So I'm going to pull this out. And my boot options, I'm going to take this off and apply it. And I'm going to go to CD-ROM and I'm going to take my CD-ROM out. And I'm going to apply it. And I say yes. Now I'm going to boot up my Windows system and it should just automatically go into Windows, and that little menu that we had before that gave you the option of choosing Linux or Windows or choosing which kernel of Linux we wanted to boot into. That little window, that menu is going to be gone. We're just going to go into Windows, the normal way because we put everything back to normal. Okay. So Windows takes a little bit time to boot up, so I'll pause the video for a few minutes. So now we're at the login screen. I'm going to type in my password, hit enter, and we're logging into Windows. And now we're in Windows. And now it's only -10. Look at that. It's getting warm out. It's only -10. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go into my file manager, and I'm going to click on my C drive, right click it, click on properties. And now we see we're still using only 23.8 gigabytes. We have 82 gigabyte left, and it's a 105 gigabyte drive. Okay, and the blue is what we're using, and the gray is free. So now I'm going to go into, so I'm going to, oops, let's close this. We don't need this open anymore. And I'm going to open up this. I'm going to go into disk management. Oh, and I forgot a step. We still got one more thing we have to do before I close the video. We have this unallocated space. And now that we've deleted our Linux main partition and our Linux boot partition, this is dead space. So now we got to increase our drive. So we got that there, we got this there. So we're going to right click this on, and we're going to extend volume. We're going to go next, and we're extending it by 22 gigabytes. So let's just go next. Let's finish it. And there it is, it's done. So now we have 127 gigabytes. So let's close this, and let's see if it works now. So now our whole drive is 127 gigabytes. We're using 23.8 gigabytes for our window install, and we have 103 gigabytes of free space in our Windows install, and everything is back to normal. And that's it. In this video, I showed you how to do a dual boot with Windows and Arch Linux. And because it's using system deboot rather than grub, I showed you how to change the kernel in your Arch Linux system with system deboot. I showed you how to log into your Windows and how to log into Arch Linux and how to choose which kernel you log into. Then I showed you how to delete your Arch Linux system and how to expand your Windows drive back to normal and how to put your whole Windows system back to normal to the way it was. And also, in doing that, it got rid of that little boot menu that comes up where you can pick and choose whether to go into Windows or Linux or the type of kernel you want to log into. And you just log into Windows the normal way, and your Windows system is back to normal. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I am the Linux Mensch.